The wind in the Wyoming Territory did not just blow. It hunted. It scoured the high plains with a grit that could sand the varnish off a wagon wheel or the hope out of a man. On the southern ridge of the Kincaid Range, the wind was the only thing speaking. It hissed through the dry needle grass and rattled the thorns of the mesquite, a ceaseless, lonely monologue that Eli Kincaid had listened to for all of his 30 years. Eli pulled his hat brim lower, shielding his eyes from the glare of the noon sun. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, terrified of taking up too much space in a world that seemed determined to crush him. He checked the barbed wire fencing, his gloved hands moving with a practiced, rhythmic competence that betrayed none of the anxiety that churned in his gut whenever he had to speak to another human being. Here, alone with the red dust and the stubborn cattle, he was steady. Here, he was safe. But the safety was an illusion, dissolving like mist under the heat. He straightened, wiping sweat from his neck with a blue kerchief, and looked north. The dust cloud on the horizon was not a storm. It was cattle, thousands of them, branded with the heavy P of Harlan Pike, the Baron of the Basin. Pike was moving his herds closer to the creek that marked the disputed boundary between his empire and Eli's struggling homestead. Eli knew the math of it, and the numbers were ugly. His father, a man whose temper had been as sudden and destructive as a summer flash flood, had left him the land, but he had also left a mountain of debt. There was an unpaid note at the bank in town, a sum of $400 that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Pike held the leverage on that note now, having bought the debt quietly, like a snake sliding into a warm boot. The lawyer from Cheyenne had explained it to Eli a month ago, using words that felt like blows. They called him unfit. They called him a bachelor with no legacy, a man squatting on prime water rights with no family to hold it. If Eli could not prove he was building a stable household, if he could not show the court that the Kincaid claim was a home and not just a bachelor's camp, the land courts would likely side with the syndicate. Pike would swallow the creek, the grazing land, and the only place Eli had ever known. Eli mounted his horse, a roan mare named Bess, and turned her away from the encroaching dust. He rode with his head down. He avoided the town of Red Rock whenever he could, but today the stagecoach was due. He reached into his vest pocket and touched the corner of the folded letter. It was sweat-stained now, the ink likely blurring, but he had memorized the words. It was a contract, cold and precise, a marriage by proxy. He had sent the money he could barely spare to a service in Tucson, a desperate gamble made in the deep silence of a winter night. He needed a wife. The law required a household. The shame of it burned him hotter than the sun. He was a man who could gentle a wild colt without a rope, who could track a stray steer through 3 days of hard shale. Yet the thought of speaking to a woman made his throat close up. He flinched at raised voices. He walked into the general store sideways, trying to make himself invisible. And now, he was riding to meet a stranger who had agreed to marry him for a ticket out of the borderlands. By the time the roofs of Red Rock broke the horizon, the sky had turned on him. The relentless sun was swallowed by a bruised purple bank of clouds rolling in from the mountains. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 10 minutes. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet slate and ozone. Eli tied Bess at the hitching rail outside the station office, keeping his eyes on his boots. The town was busy. Men shouted over the rising wind, securing loose shutters. A few cowboys from the Pike outfit lounged on the porch of the saloon across the street, their laughter sharp and jagged. Eli felt their eyes on him, or perhaps he only imagined it. He felt branded by his own awkwardness. "Storm's coming. Kincaid," the station master shouted from the doorway. He was a round man with a face like a dried apple. "Stage is late." "I will wait," Eli said. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He stood under the overhang, arms crossed tight against his chest. He watched the rain begin. It did not start gently. It arrived as a curtain of ice-cold needles, driving sideways, turning the dusty street into a slick of brown grease. When the stagecoach finally lunged out of the gloom, The horses were frothing, their heads tossed back against the biting sleet. The driver cursed, hauling on the reins, the brake lever screeching like a dying hawk. The coach rocked to a halt, mud splattering the boardwalk. The door swung open. A salesman in a plaid suit tumbled out, holding a satchel over his head, running for the hotel. Then, a pause. A boot appeared. Small, worn leather, cracked at the heel. Clara Vale stepped down into the mud. She did not run for cover. She stood by the wheel for a moment, steadying herself. She wore a dress of dark gray wool that had seen better years, the hem heavy with travel dust and now drinking up the rain. A shawl was wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked up, scanning the street not with the wide eyes of a lost girl, but with the sharp, darting gaze of a hawk searching for a snake. She was thin. That was Eli's first thought. She looked like something the wind had whittled down to the bone. Her hair was tucked under a severe bonnet, but a few strands of dark copper had escaped, plastered to her cheek by the rain. Eli forced his feet to move. He stepped off the boardwalk, the mud sucking at his boots. He took off his hat, ignoring the freezing rain that instantly soaked his hair. "Miss Vale?" he asked. He hated how his voice cracked. She turned. Her eyes were green, the color of moss in a deep canyon, and they held no warmth. They measured him. She looked at his hands, checking for fists. She looked at his belt, checking for a gun. She looked at his mouth, checking for a sneer. "Mr. Kincaid," she said. Her voice was low, raspy, as if she had not spoken in days. "I am Clara," he nodded, unable to meet her gaze for more than a second. He gestured vaguely toward his wagon, parked further down the line. "I have the buckboard. We should go. The creek rises fast." She did not move immediately. She looked past him, toward the mercantile where two women stood under the awning. They were church women, respectable women, their skirts gathered up to avoid the splash. They were staring at Clara. "That is her," one of them whispered, loud enough to cut through the rain. "The one from the border, references from a saloon keeper. Can you imagine?" "Border trash," the other murmured, her nose wrinkling as if she smelled sour milk. No respectable woman lists a place like that. He must be desperate. Eli flinched. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. He waited for Clara to cry, to shout, to crumble. She did none of those things. Clara Vale merely tightened her grip on her small, battered valise. Her expression did not change. She had a stillness about her, a practiced invisibility that Eli recognized because he carried it too. She turned her back on the women and looked at Eli. "I am ready," she said. He took her bag. It was light, terrifyingly light. Was this everything she owned in the world? A whole life in a bag a child could lift? He helped her up onto the wagon seat. His hand brushed her elbow, and he felt her stiffen, her muscles locking up like a trap snapping shut. He pulled his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. "I am sorry," he mumbled. "It is fine," she said, staring straight ahead into the rain. The ride to the ranch was an ordeal of silence and mud. The wagon lurched through ruts that were rapidly turning into small rivers. The wind howled, shaking the canvas cover Eli had rigged up, but the cold seeped through every gap. Eli sat hunched over the reins, focusing entirely on the ears of the horses. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell her that the house was dry, that he had food, that he was sorry the town was cruel. But the words died in his throat, choked off by the fear that anything he said would be wrong. He was a boring man, a quiet man. What could he offer a woman who had clearly seen the hard edges of the world? Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap. She watched the landscape roll by. It was vast, empty, and terrifying. In the border town, there had been noise, people, the constant crush of humanity. Here, there was nothing but sagebrush and gray sky. If she screamed here, the sound would simply be eaten by the wind. She looked at the man beside her. He was large, broad-shouldered. He had not looked her in the eye since the station. Was he angry? Was he disgusted by what he had bought? She had learned to read men by the way they held their liquor and the way they used their hands. This man held the reins with a gentle touch. He did not whip the horses when they stumbled. He spoke to them, low, soothing sounds that the wind nearly stole. That was good. Or perhaps it was a trick. The quiet ones were sometimes the worst when the door was closed. They arrived at the homestead as the last of the daylight bled out of the sky, leaving a bruise of indigo over the western hills. The ranch house was small, a simple structure of weathered timber and stone, huddled against a rise in the land for protection from the north wind. A barn stood nearby, dark and leaning slightly. Eli pulled the wagon up to the porch. "We are here." She climbed down before he could help her, her boots sinking into the wet earth. She followed him inside. The main room was warm. Eli had left the fire banked, and the smell of wood smoke and coffee hung in the air. It was clean. Clara noted. The floor was swept. There were no piles of dirty clothes, no empty bottles. It was sparse, almost like a monk's cell. A table, 2 chairs, a stove. "I put your things in there," Eli said, pointing to a door on the left. "I sleep in the loft." He was establishing distance. Clara relaxed slightly. Though she kept her shoulders braced, he was not expecting to share a bed immediately. She walked to the door he indicated and pushed it open. The room was small. There was a narrow bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. On the shelf above the bed, there was a small wooden carving. Clara stepped closer. It was a horse, whittled from pine, clumsy but loving. It looked like a toy made for a child. Beside it lay a ribbon, faded red, the silk fraying at the edges. She reached out to touch the ribbon. "Do not!" Eli's voice came from the doorway, sharp and sudden. Clara jerked her hand back, spinning around. Eli stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a panic that looked like anger. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, not towards her, but to the shelf. He grabbed the ribbon and the wooden horse, his hands shaking, and shoved them into the top drawer of the chest. He slammed the drawer shut. The sound echoed in the small room. Eli breathed hard, his back to her. He looked ashamed. "I am sorry. Those are old. I should have cleared them." "It is all right," Clara said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "I did not mean to pry." "Supper," Eli said, the word coming out strangled. "I will make supper." He fled the room. They ate in silence. Stew made of venison and potatoes. It was hot and filling. Clara ate methodically, scraping the bowl clean. She did not know when the next meal would come. Survival had taught her to never leave food on a plate. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and suffocating. The wind had died. The only sound was the settling of the timbers in the house and the crackle of the fire in the stove. Night had fallen completely. The oil lamp on the table cast long, wavering shadows. Eli stood up and cleared the dishes. He washed them in a basin, his back to her. Clara watched his shoulders. The tension in the room was rising, a physical pressure against her skin. She knew what this was. She knew the arrangement. She was a wife. A wife had duties. In the saloon. She had seen what happened to women who did not pay their debts, who did not smile when they were told to smile. She had survived by being useful, by being invisible, and by understanding the transaction. He needed a wife to keep his land. She needed a home to keep from starving, or worse. He had paid for her ticket. He had fed her. Now, the bill was due. She stood up. Her legs felt weak. She walked to the center of the room. "Mr. Kincaid," she said. Eli turned, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who wanted to run out the door and keep running until he hit the ocean. "Eli," he said softly. "Please, call me Eli." "Eli," she repeated. She took a breath. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her high collar. Her fingers were trembling, but she forced them to work. She had to show him she was willing. She had to show him she was not a bad investment. Eli went still. He dropped the towel. "Clara, what are you doing?" "I know what is expected," she said. Her voice was thin, brittle. I am your wife now. I want to be. I want to be a good wife. She took a step closer to him. He did not move. He stared at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she could not read. Was it hunger? She started, then faltered. She felt the heat rising in her face, the deep, old shame of the places she had been and the things she had heard through thin walls. She looked at his belt buckle because she could not look at his eyes. I am your wife. Can I? She gestured vaguely, a halting, humiliating offer of intimacy that she thought men wanted. The words died in her throat. She stopped, bracing herself. She waited for him to grab her, to laugh, or to tell her to get on her knees. She squeezed her eyes shut. No. The word was a rough croak. Clara flinched. She opened her eyes. Eli had backed away until he hit the edge of the stove. He was trembling. His hands were held up, palms out, as if she were the one with a knife. No, he said again, louder this time. Do not, please. I do not understand, Clara whispered. I know where you came from, Eli said. His voice was shaking. I know you had to survive, but you are not that here. You are not a thing I bought. He ran a hand through his hair, gripping the strands tight. My father. He took what he wanted. He was a man who thought the world owed him everything, including the women in his house. I am not him, I swear to you. Clara, I am not him. He looked at her then, and the raw vulnerability in his face took her breath away. He was terrified. He was not scared of her. He was scared of himself. He was scared of the potential for cruelty that lived in all men. I will not touch you, he said, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. Not until you choose it. Not until you want it. If that takes a year, or 10 years, or forever. You are safe here. Do you understand? You are safe. Clara stood frozen. The speech confused her. Kindness was a foreign language. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty had rules. You could navigate cruelty. But this gentle, terrified restraint? She looked at his large hands, still held up in surrender. Something inside her, some tight, coiled spring that she had been holding together for years, suddenly snapped. It was not a sob. It was a shudder that started in her knees and rolled up her spine. She began to shake. I do not know how to be safe, she admitted, the truth falling out of her mouth before she could stop it. Eli moved then. He did not grab her. He stepped forward slowly, telegraphing every movement. He reached out and awkwardly, hesitantly, placed his hands on her upper arms. His grip was light, barely there. We will learn, he said. We will learn together. The warmth of his hands seeped through the thin wool of her dress. Clara looked up at him. He was not looking at her body. He was looking at her face, searching for fear. She leaned forward, just an inch. It was a surrender, but not the kind she had prepared for. She rested her forehead against his chest. He smelled of rain and sawdust and soap. He stiffened for a second. Then, slowly, his arms came around her. He held her. He did not grope. He just held her, forming a wall between her and the world. The lamp flickered. The shadows lengthened. For the first time in her life, Clara Vale closed her eyes and did not count the seconds until she could escape. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, two broken people holding each other up against the dark. Later, the darkness of the room felt different. It was no longer empty. Eli lay in the loft, staring at the rough beams of the ceiling. He could hear Clara's breathing from the room below, soft and rhythmic. He shifted, the straw mattress rustling. His body hummed with a tension he had never known. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. The realization terrified him. He had thought he just needed a signature on a paper, a presence in the house to satisfy the judge. But holding her, feeling the small, bird-like tremble of her frame against his. Something had shifted. He had crossed a line inside himself. She was not just a contract. She was Clara, and she was terrified. He rolled onto his side, staring into the blackness. If he wanted her, he had to deserve her. And to deserve her, he had to keep her. The morning brought a cold. pale sun that offered no heat. Eli rose before dawn, the habit of work pulling him from a restless sleep. He went out to the porch, pulling on his coat against the bite of the air. He stopped. The gate at the end of the yard was open. It had been closed last night. Eli walked down the steps, his boots crunching on the frost. He reached the gate and saw the hoof prints in the mud, fresh, 3 riders, maybe 4. They had sat there, just outside the perimeter of the house, watching. There was a piece of paper nailed to the fence post. Eli ripped it down. The handwriting was jagged, scrawled with a heavy hand, "Sell by the end of the month. Kincaid, or accidents will decide it for you." It was signed with a simple, jagged P. Eli crushed the paper in his fist. He looked south towards the endless stretch of fence he had to ride, and then back at the house, where smoke was just beginning to curl from the chimney. Clara was awake. The wind kicked up again, whistling through the wire, sounding like a warning. Eli Kincaid stood between the open range and his front door, and for the first time, he did not look down. He looked at the horizon, and his eyes were hard. He put the note in his pocket and turned back to the house. The Wyoming wind did not bargain. It took what it wanted, stripping the moisture from the soil and the softness from the skin. For Clara Vale. The first month on the Kincaid Ranch was a lesson in abrasion. Her hands, once accustomed to the smooth glass of whiskey tumblers and the velvet of worn cards, were now mapped with blisters that broke and bled and hardened into calluses. She woke before the sun. The mornings were deceptively beautiful, the sky a bruised purple that lightened to a pale, freezing blue. But the air bit deep. She hauled water from the pump near the barn, the bucket handle digging into her palms. The water was heavy, sloshing over the rim to freeze on her boots. She chopped wood, her swing awkward at first, the axe head bouncing dangerously off the knots until she learned to read the grain. The landscape was brutal. One afternoon, a dust storm rose up like a solid wall of copper, blotting out the sun and turning the noon sky to midnight. Clara had been caught near the chicken coop. The grit filled her nose and mouth, blinding her. She had dropped to her knees, covering her head, waiting for it to pass. When the wind finally died, she stood up, shook the dust from her skirts, and finished gathering the eggs. She refused to complain. To complain was to admit weakness, and in her experience, weakness attracted predators. Eli watched her. He did not hover, but he was always there, on the periphery of her vision. He taught her with a quiet patience that unnerved her. In the border town, men taught with shouts or the back of a hand. If you did it wrong, you were punished. Eli was different. "You are cinching it too tight," he said one morning in the barn. Clara jumped, dropping the leather strap. She backed up against the stall door, her breath hitching. She waited for the reprimand. Eli stood by the mare's shoulder. He did not look at Clara. He ran a hand down the horse's neck. "If you pinch her skin, she will buck. She is not mean, just sensitive. Like us." He gestured for Clara to step forward. "Here, slide your fingers under the girth. If you can fit 2 fingers flat, it is right." Clara stepped closer, her heart hammering. She reached out, sliding her hand between the warm horsehair and the stiff leather. Eli's hand was inches from hers. He did not grab her. He did not correct her posture. He simply waited. "It fits," she whispered. "Good," Eli said. "You have a gentle touch. Clara, the animals like that." He walked away to gather the bridles. Clara stared at his back. His patience felt like a trap. No man was this patient unless he was saving up for a truly terrible explosion. She kept her guard up, watching his hands, watching his eyes, waiting for the Kincaid tempers she had heard rumors about. But the days bled into weeks, and the explosion did not come. Instead, the tension shifted to the town. They needed supplies, flour, coffee, nails for the fence repairs. The ride into Red Rock was stiff and silent. Eli sat high on the wagon seat, his eyes scanning the horizon. Clara sat beside him, her spine straight, her hands folded so tight her knuckles were white. When they walked into the mercantile, the conversation died. It was a physical thing. The silence. It started at the counter and rippled outward to the back of the store where two men were inspecting a plow. Clara felt the eyes on her back. They felt like insects crawling on her skin. She walked to the dry goods section, picking up a sack of beans. "We are out of those," the clerk said loudly. Clara looked at the sack in her hand. "There are 6 bags here." The clerk, a young man with a thin mustache, looked over her shoulder at someone behind her, smirking. "Reserved. All of them. For paying customers." "My husband's money is legal tender," Clara said. Her voice was calm, pitched low. She did not sound angry. She sounded bored. It was a tone she had perfected in the chaotic nights of the saloon. A tone that said, "You cannot touch me. We do not serve saloon trash here." A woman's voice cut through the air. It was Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. She stood by the fabric bolts, holding a length of blue calico. She looked at Clara with a mixture of fascination and disgust. "My husband says it is a disgrace, bringing a woman like that into a decent community." Eli appeared at Clara's elbow. He did not shout. He did not posture. He simply took the sack of beans from Clara's hand and placed it on the counter. He stared at the clerk. Eli was a big man, and in the small space between the counters, he seemed to take up all the air. "Ring it up," Eli said. "I told her—" The clerk started. "Ring it up." Eli's voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. The clerk swallowed. He rang up the beans. His hands shook as he took the coins Eli placed on the wood. Outside, as they loaded the wagon, Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I have been called worse things by better men." Eli paused, his hand on the wagon wheel. He looked at her, his dark eyes troubled. "You are my wife. Clara, they do not get to speak to you that way." "They speak the truth, Eli," she said, looking away toward the saloon down the street. The piano music drifted out, tinny and hollow. "I worked where men drank. I poured the whiskey. I smiled when they wanted me to smile. That is who I was." "It is not who you are," Eli said stubbornly. "You do not know who I am," she snapped, the frustration finally bubbling over. "I saw a man die, Eli, in that place. I saw a man shot for spilling a drink, and I saw the sheriff arrest the boy who swept the floors because the shooter bought the law a round of drinks. I learned that truth does not matter. Only power matters. You fighting a clerk for a bag of beans does not change that." Eli looked at her for a long time. "Maybe not, but I will not let them starve us out." That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy with the things they had almost said. Eli sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of Clara's work gloves. He used a thick needle and heavy thread, his large fingers moving with surprising delicacy. Clara was at the stove, stirring a stew. She watched him. "My father," Eli said suddenly into the quiet. "He was a loud man. He liked to hear his own voice, and he liked the sound of his fist hitting things." Clara stopped stirring. "He used to hit my mother," Eli continued, not looking up from the glove. "Not when he was drunk. When he was sober, he liked the control. One day, when I was 16, he raised a shovel to her because she had let the fire go out." Eli pulled the thread tight, biting off the end. "I hit him," Eli said. "I took a pitchfork handle and I hit him. I broke his arm, and then I hit him again, and again. I wanted to kill him. Clara, I stood over him and I felt good. I felt strong." He looked up at her then, and his eyes were full of a terrified grief. "I stopped, but the feeling, it was there, the Kincaid blood. It is violent. That is why I am quiet. That is why I do not fight unless I have to. I am afraid that if I start, I will not be able to stop. I am afraid I am him." Clara left the stove. She walked to his chair and took the mended glove from his hand. She looked at the stitching. It was neat, even, and strong. A man who is afraid of his own violence is not a monster. "Eli," she said softly, "a monster does not care." She put the glove on. It fit perfectly. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, unable to speak. and went outside to check the horses. The attacks from the town grew more coordinated. It wasn't just insults anymore. It was paper. A week later, a sheriff's deputy rode out to the ranch. He was a slick man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He handed Eli a folded document. "Notice a boundary dispute," the deputy said, chewing on a toothpick. "And illegal use of the creek. Mr. Pike's lawyers say you are drawing water from the upper fork. That belongs to the syndicate." "My father filed that water claim 30 years ago," Eli said, holding the paper without looking at it. "Paperwork got lost. Maybe," the deputy shrugged. "Or maybe it was never right. Either way, you got 2 weeks to cease drawing water or face a fine, a big one." He tipped his hat to Clara, who was watching from the porch. "Ma'am, you look familiar. Did you ever work up in Deadwood?" "No," Clara said coldly. "My mistake." The deputy smirked. "You just have that look." He rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a sense of encroaching doom. Pike was tightening the noose. Without the creek water, the herd would not survive the summer. The pressure boiled over 3 days later. Clara had gone into town alone to pick up a package from the stage office. Seeds she had ordered, hoping for a garden. Eli was fixing a fence line, and she had insisted she could handle the trip. She was walking back to the wagon when a hand clamped around her wrist. It was a cowboy, smelling of stale beer and sweat. He yanked her into the alleyway between the hotel and the barber shop. "You're the Kincaid bride," he slurred. He was big, heavy-set. "Pretty thing. Too pretty for a dirt farmer like him." Clara did not scream. She went still. It was the possum response, a survival trick she had learned at 12. If you scream, they hit you. If you fight, they get angry. If you go still, they get confused. "Let go," she said evenly. "Just want to see if the rumors are true." He laughed, pulling her closer. "If you know how to treat a man." Clara's free hand moved to her skirt pocket, where she kept a small folding knife. She was calculating the angle to his ribs when a shadow fell over them. "Let her go." It wasn't a shout. It was a command, spoken with the finality of a closing coffin lid. The cowboy turned. Eli stood at the mouth of the alley. He was not wearing his gun belt. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, but his whole body was coiled. "This ain't your business, plowboy." The cowboy sneered. "She is my wife," Eli said. He took one step forward. "And you are touching her." The cowboy laughed and shoved Clara back against the wall. He reached for his hip, but he was drunk and slow. Eli moved with a speed that defied his size. He stepped in, blocked the cowboy's arm, and drove a fist into the man's solar plexus. The sound was a wet thud. The cowboy folded in half, gasping for air. Eli grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against the brick wall. He held him there, feet dangling inches off the ground. Eli's face was inches from the man's nose. Eli was shaking, vibrating with a rage so intense the air around him seemed to crackle. "If you ever," Eli whispered, "ever look at her again, I will not stop at your stomach. Do you understand?" The cowboy nodded frantically, his face purple. Eli dropped him. The man scrambled away on hands and knees, retching in the dirt. Eli turned to Clara. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and the rage in his eyes vanished, replaced by a horror that chilled her. He looked at his own hands, then at her. "Did he hurt you?" Eli asked. "No," Clara said. She stepped away from the wall. Eli started, then stopped. He turned and walked rapidly toward the wagon. The ride home was fast. Eli drove the horses hard. When they reached the ranch, he jumped down and began unhitching them with frantic, jerky movements. "Eli," Clara said, coming up behind him. "I almost killed him," Eli said, not turning around. I wanted to snap his neck." "But you did not," Clara said. "You stopped." "I am dangerous," he said, turning to face her. "You should not be here. Clara, you should not be with a man like me. I cannot protect you the right way. I am just like my father." "Stop it!" Clara shouted. It was the first time she had raised her voice at him. "Stop pitying yourself. You are nothing like him. You protected me." "I should not have to," Eli roared back. "You should be safe. You should be in a house where men do not grab you in alleys. I brought you here to this war. I am using you to keep my land, and it is going to get you hurt." "I can handle ugliness," Clara yelled, stepping into his space. "I have handled worse than a drunk cowboy. I am not glass. Eli, I am not some porcelain doll you put on a shelf. I am here. I am your partner." They stood chest to chest, breathing heavy in the cold twilight. The anger hung between them, sharp and electric. "I know you are not glass," Eli said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I want you to be soft. I want you to have peace. I hate that you have to be hard to survive me." Clara looked at his face, lined with dust and worry. She saw the love beneath the fear. He wasn't trying to control her. He was trying to shield her. And he was failing. And it was breaking his heart. She reached up and took his face in her hands. His skin was rough, unshaven. "I am not surviving you, Eli," she said softly. "I am choosing you." She pulled his head down. This time, she did not ask permission. She did not ask, "Can I?" She simply kissed him. It was tentative at first, a question asked with lips instead of words. Eli stood frozen for a heartbeat, his arms rigid at his sides. Then, a groan ripped from his throat. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her against him. Lifting her off her feet, he kissed her back with a desperate, starving intensity. It was not the kiss of a polite stranger. It was the kiss of a man who had been lonely for 30 years. He carried her into the house, kicking the door shut behind them. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the stove. He set her down by the bed. His hands were shaking again, but not from fear of violence. He touched her face, tracing the line of her jaw with his thumb. "Clara," he breathed. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said. She began to unbutton his shirt. "I am your wife, and I am tired of being afraid." He lowered his head to her neck. He was gentle, so incredibly gentle, as if she were made of something precious that could shatter. But there was heat there too, a fire that warmed the cold places inside her. They came together in the dark, shedding the layers of wool and defense they had both worn for so long. It was not a performance. There was no need to smile, no need to pretend. There was only skin and breath and the shocking, terrifying realization that they belonged to each other. Later, as the moon rose high and white over the plains, Clara lay awake. Eli was asleep beside her, one arm thrown heavily over her waist, anchoring her to the bed. She felt different. She felt seen. She slipped out from under his arm and padded across the cold floor to her trunk. She knelt and opened the false bottom she had constructed years ago. Inside lay a small bundle of papers. She pulled out a letter. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. It was from Sarah, the girl who had been like a sister to her in the border town. Sarah, who had found a ledger. Sarah, who had tried to do the right thing. Clara read the name in the second paragraph. Harlan Pike. Sarah had written that Pike was moving stolen cattle through the border, rebranding them, and using a network of corrupt officials to hide the money. She had written that she was going to turn the ledger over to a marshal. 2 days later, Sarah was dead, a stray bullet in a bar fight. But Clara had seen the man who started the fight. He was on Pike's payroll. Clara looked at Eli, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. She had proof. Not enough to convict, maybe, but enough to start a fire. But if she used it, if she brought this into the light, Pike would stop at nothing. She folded the letter and put it back. She would not hide it forever. But for tonight, she would let him sleep. The peace did not last. 2 days later, the town held its annual Founders' Day picnic. It was a social obligation Eli said they could not ignore if they wanted to maintain their standing as a legitimate household. They rode into town dressed in their Sunday best. Clara wore a dress of dark blue that she had altered to fit her slender frame. She held her head high, but as they walked through the crowd, the atmosphere shifted. The whispering was louder this time. A man stepped out from the crowd near the bandstand. He was older, with a scarred face and eyes that looked like dead fish. Well, the man said, his voice carrying over the fiddle music. If it isn't Clara, or should I say, Red. Clara froze. She knew him. Looking Glass Saloon, 5 years ago. I wondered where you ran off to. The man grinned, looking at the crowd that was gathering. Folks, you got a celebrity in your midst. This here is the finest enticement the border ever produced. Cost me $2 for an hour, didn't it? Red, the crowd gasped. The silence that followed was absolute. Eli dropped Clara's arm. He took a step toward the man. Eli, no, Clara hissed, grabbing his sleeve. $2. The man laughed. And she was worth every penny. Tell me, Kincaid, did you get a discount for the wedding ring? Eli went white. Not red, but a deathly, chalky white. Clara stood there, the sun beating down on her, feeling the judgment of the town settle on her like a shroud. She saw the churchwomen nodding, their suspicions confirmed. She saw the men smirking. She looked at Eli. He wasn't looking at the man anymore. He was looking at her. And in that moment, with the town staring and the lie hanging in the air like smoke, Clara Vale wondered if love was enough to survive the truth. Let's go, Eli said. His voice was dead. He did not hit the man. He did not defend her honor. He turned around and walked toward the horses. Clara stood alone for a second, the laughter of the crowd ringing in her ears, before she turned and followed him, her head high, her heart breaking into dust. The drought descended on the Wyoming territory like a slow suffocation. It was not a singular event, but a tightening of the screw, day by burning day. The sky turned a relentless, pale blue that offered no shade and no mercy. The clouds that did appear were high and thin, teasing the land with the promise of rain before dissolving into nothingness. For Eli and Clara Kincaid, survival became a matter of arithmetic. They spoke in numbers. 20 gallons of water remaining in the lower trough, 40 bales of hay stacked in the barn, 12 hours of daylight to mend what the wind and the rust had broken. The ranch house, once a place of quiet isolation, was now a fortress against the elements. Dust found its way through every crack in the chinking. It coated the table, the bed sheets, and the rim of the water pitcher. Clara swept 3 times a day, her jaw set in a line of grim determination, refusing to let the grit win. They worked as a single unit now. The awkwardness of their early days had been burned away by necessity. Eli no longer hesitated to ask for her help, and Clara no longer waited for permission to give it. When they rode out to check the herd, they rode stirrup to stirrup, but the ranch felt different. The loneliness that had once been peaceful now felt heavy with threat. The horizon was not just empty, it was watching them. The Sunday after the confrontation at the Founders' Day picnic, Clara insisted on going to the church social. Eli had argued against it, his voice tight with the urge to protect her from more pain. But Clara had been adamant. If we hide, she had said, tying her bonnet strings with steady fingers, they win. If we hide, we admit that what that man said defines me. It does not. So they went. The church hall was stiflingly hot, smelling of stale coffee and lavender water. When Clara walked in, holding a platter of cornbread she had baked that morning, the room did not go silent as it had at the store. It was worse. The room pretended she did not exist. She walked toward the long table where the food was laid out. 2 women, wives of local ranchers, were standing there arranging slices of ham. As Clara approached, they turned their backs to her in unison, closing the gap between them so there was no space for her platter. They began to talk loudly about the price of sugar. Clara stood there, the heavy ceramic platter straining her wrists. She looked for a place to set it down. A small girl, perhaps 5 years old, wandered over, eyeing the cornbread. She reached out a chubby hand. "Clara!" The mother's voice cracked like a whip. "Mrs. Miller." The sheriff's wife lunged across the space, grabbing her daughter's arm and jerking her back so hard the child stumbled. "Do not touch that, Mrs." Miller hissed, loud enough for half the room to hear. "We do not know where her hands have been." Clara did not flinch. She did not look at the floor. She gently set the platter on the very edge of the table, where it teetered slightly before settling. She straightened her spine. She looked Mrs. Miller in the eye. The woman's face was flushed with self-righteous heat, but her eyes darted away, unable to hold Clara's gaze. Clara turned and walked back to where Eli stood by the door. He was vibrating with tension. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We are leaving," Eli said, his voice a low growl. "No," Clara said softly. "We will stay for the sermon. We have done nothing wrong." They sat in the back pew. They sang the hymns. They listened to the preacher talk about charity and forgiveness, while the congregation sat with stiff backs and cold hearts. When it was over, they walked out into the blinding sunlight, heads high, having refused to collapse. But the drive home was silent, and Clara's hands shook in her lap until Eli covered them with his own. The escalation began 3 nights later. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering little light. Eli woke to the sound of lowing cattle, not the contented chewing of the cud, but the distressed, confused bellows of a herd on the move. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before his eyes were fully open. "What is it?" Clara asked from the darkness, her voice sharp with instant wakefulness. "Cattle," Eli said. "Wrong place. Sounds like the South Ridge." They saddled the horses in the dark, fingers fumbling with buckles by touch. They rode out with rifles scabbarded, the cool night air rushing past them. When they reached the South Ridge, the disaster was plain even in the gloom. The wire fence, which Eli had restrung only a month ago, had been cut, not broken by a charging bull, but cut cleanly with wire cutters, the strands curled back like dead vines. Through the gap, 50 head of cattle had wandered into the rough country of the Devil's Wash, a tangle of ravines and loose shale that could break a leg as easily as a twig. "They are pushing them toward the Badlands," Eli shouted over the wind. For the next 4 hours, they rode like demons. The terrain was treacherous. Shale slid under the horses' hooves, sending showers of rock clattering into the dark. Eli rode with a reckless competence that Clara had never seen. He drove his mare down steep embankments, whistling sharply to turn the stragglers, using his rope to snap at the heels of stubborn steers. Clara rode the flank. She was exhausted, her legs screaming from the grip on the saddle, but she did not slow down. She saw Eli in the moonlight, his silhouette jagged and determined. He did not posture. He did not waste energy on curses or anger. He simply worked. He was a man who spoke the language of the land and the animals, and tonight he was fighting for them. By dawn, they had turned the herd back. The cattle were spooked and lathered, but they were on Kincaid grass. Eli slid from his saddle near the cut fence. He stumbled when his boots hit the ground, his knees buckling from sheer exhaustion. He caught himself on the fence post, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Clara dismounted and went to him. She saw the fatigue etched into his face, the gray circles under his eyes. He looked brittle, as if one strong wind would snap him in two. "They want to wear us down," Eli rasped, touching the severed wire. "They know they cannot win in court yet, so they will kill us by inches. No sleep, no safety." "We fixed it," Clara said, handing him his canteen. "We brought them back. This time," Eli said. He took a long drink, water spilling down his chin. "Next time they might run them off a cliff." They were mending the wire as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. The sound of hooves approaching made them both freeze. 3 riders appeared on the rise. At the front was Silas Vance, Harlan Pike's foreman. He was a man built like a barrel, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left to weather. Eli stood up slowly. He picked up his rifle, not aiming it, but holding it across his chest. Clara moved to stand slightly behind him, her hand resting near the pistol tucked in her belt. "Morning, Kincaid," Vance called out. He did not smile. "Looks like you had some trouble." "Trespassers," Eli said calmly. "Cut my fence." "Is that so?" Vance rode closer, stopping his horse just on the other side of the wire. "Shame." Maybe your cows just know where the better water is. The creek on Mr. Pike's land is flowing real nice." "The creek is common water," Eli said, "and the boundary is 5 miles south." "You know that, Vance." "I know what the map says today," Vance said, leaning on his saddle horn. "Maps change. Owners change, mister. Pike is a patient man, but he hates to see good land wasted on a man who cannot hold it." Vance's eyes flicked to Clara. He looked her up and down with a slow, insolent stare. "And he surely hates to see a lady working so hard. Maybe she would be happier in town. I hear she has friends there." Eli's knuckles turned white on the rifle stock. The muscles in his jaw jumped. Clara saw the shift in him, the Kincaid blood rising, the urge to end the insult with a bullet. The air between the men grew thin and tight. "Get off my land," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it vibrated with a deadly frequency. Vance chuckled. "I am on the public road. Neighbor, just passing through." He turned his horse. "Fix that fence good, Kincaid. Be a shame if it happened again tonight." As they rode away, Eli lowered the rifle. He stood staring after them, his chest heaving. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. He had chosen strategy. He had chosen not to give Pike the excuse of a shooting war, but Clara could see the cost of it. The restraint was eating him alive. That night, the reality of their siege settled into the house. Clara prepared for bed with a ritual that broke Eli's heart to watch. She checked the heavy bolt on the front door twice. She checked the shutters on the windows. When she climbed into bed, she slid a small, sharp paring knife under her pillow. She did it casually, as if she were tucking away a handkerchief. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. "You should not have to sleep with a knife." "I sleep better with it," Clara said simply. She lay back, her dark hair fanning out on the white pillowcase. "It is not because I do not trust you, Eli. It is because I know the world." Eli did not try to talk her out of it. He did not tell her it was foolish. He simply nodded, blew out the lamp, and lay down beside her. He reached for her hand in the dark, interlacing their fingers. He squeezed tight, and she squeezed back. It was an acknowledgement of their shared reality. They were the only two people in the world they could trust. The days that followed were consumed by a new mission. If they could not fight Pike with guns, they would fight him with paper. They turned the kitchen table into a war room. Clara unlocked her trunk and brought out the bundle of letters. She showed Eli the ledger pages she had managed to keep, the ones Sarah had stolen. "Here," Clara pointed to a column of figures. "This matches the dates when Pike was moving herds across the border. And here, this name, Judge Halloway. He was the one who dismissed the charges against Pike's men in Tucson." "It is a pattern," Eli said, tracing the lines with a calloused finger. "He buys the law before he breaks it." "We need a witness," Clara said. "The letters are hearsay without someone to swear to them. But if we can get this to the circuit judge in Cheyenne, Judge Atherton is known to be hard, but honest, we might get an injunction." "Cheyenne is 4 days' ride," Eli said. "And we cannot leave the ranch undefended." "We cannot stay here and wait to be burned out," Clara countered. They decided to go to the town sheriff first, to test the waters. Perhaps, Eli hoped. Sheriff Miller was merely incompetent, not corrupt. If they could file an official report about the fence cutting, it would be on the record for the circuit judge. It was a mistake. Eli rode into town to file the report, leaving Clara at the ranch to guard the house. He returned 3 hours later, his face gray. "Miller would not take the report," Eli said, throwing his hat on the table. "He said without proof of who cut the wire, it is just wear and tear. And then—" Eli paused, looking sick. "Then I saw him, in the back office, drinking whiskey from a bottle with a distinct blue label, the same whiskey Pike imports for his private stock. He is bought," Clara said. She did not look surprised. "We have no law here." 2 days later, the war came to Clara. Eli was working on the windmill, the metal gears screeching in the dry wind. Clara had walked down to the creek, the lower section that was still undeniably theirs, to wash the dust from the laundry. It was a quarter-mile from the house, obscured by a line of cottonwoods. She was scrubbing a shirt against the washboard, the cold water numbing her fingers. When the birds in the trees suddenly went silent, Clara straightened. She wiped her hands on her apron. She listened. The rustle of the brush was behind her. She spun around, reaching for the small knife she now carried in her pocket. But she was too slow. A rope hissed through the air. A lasso loop dropped over her shoulders and tightened instantly, pinning her arms to her sides. She was jerked off her feet, dragging through the gravel and mud. She didn't scream. She kicked. She twisted her body, fighting the rope. But the man on the other end was strong. She was hauled up against the trunk of a cottonwood tree. A man stepped out of the brush. He was wearing a mask, a simple bandana pulled up over his nose. "This is a warning," the man whispered. He stepped close, smelling of tobacco and horse sweat. He pulled the rope tighter, the rough hemp burning into her neck. "Tell your husband to sell. Tell him the next time. The rope goes over a branch, not around your arms." He drew a knife. Clara stopped breathing. She stared at his eyes. Hard, flat, indifferent. He brought the knife up and slashed it across her arm, shallow but long. A line of bright red blood bloomed on her sleeve. "Sell," he hissed. He shoved her hard against the tree, loosened the rope, and vanished back into the brush. Clara sank to the ground. She touched her throat. It was throbbing. She looked at her arm. The cut was stinging, but it wasn't deep. It was precise. It was a message. She scrambled up, grabbing the knife she had dropped, and ran back to the house. When Eli saw her, he dropped his tools and ran to meet her. He caught her as she stumbled up the porch steps. "Clara!" He saw the blood on her sleeve. He saw the angry red welt circling her neck. His face went terrifyingly blank. "Who?" he asked. "Masked?" Clara gasped, leaning against him. "One man, down by the creek. He said to sell." Eli did not speak. He helped her inside. He sat her down and cleaned the cut on her arm with trembling hands. He put a cold compress on her throat. He was gentle, efficient, and utterly silent. Then he stood up. He walked to the gun cabinet. He took out his Winchester repeating rifle. He took out the heavy Colt revolver. He began to load them. "Eli," Clara said. He did not answer. He shoved cartridges into the loading gate of the rifle. Click, click, click. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. "Eli, look at me," Clara said. He turned. His eyes were not the eyes of the man she loved. They were the eyes of a stranger, cold, empty, filled with a singular, murderous purpose. "I am going to kill them," he said. His voice was flat. "I am going to ride to Pike's ranch, and I am going to kill Vance. And then I am going to find Pike, and I am going to kill him. I am done waiting." He turned for the door. "No!" Clara cried out. Stumbling up from the chair, she ran to him, grabbing his arm. He was like a stone statue. He did not stop. He dragged her a few steps before stopping at the door. "Let go, Clara. They hurt you. They put a rope on you." "If you go there," Clara said, her voice shaking, "you will die. They have 20 men. You will kill one, maybe two, and then they will cut you down, and I will be alone." "I cannot let this stand," Eli shouted, the control finally snapping. He slammed his hand against the doorframe. "I am a man. I am supposed to protect you. If I do not kill him, I am nothing. I am weak." He slumped against the door, the rifle clattering to the floor. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving with dry, tearing sobs. "I am weak. I am just a coward who hides behind fences." Clara picked up the rifle and set it aside. She walked to him. She reached up and pulled his hands away from his face. "Look at me," she commanded. He looked at her, his face wet with tears of shame. "You are not weak," she said fiercely. "Pike is weak. Vance is weak. They use power to hurt because they are small. You," she touched his chest, "you have the power to kill, and you choose not to. That is not cowardice. Eli, that is the hardest thing a man can do." She pressed her forehead against his. "You did not become him. You did not become your father. You stayed you, and that is the man I need. I do not need a dead hero. I need a living husband." Eli shuddered, the tension draining out of him, leaving him hollow. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, careful of the bruise. "I wanted to," he whispered. "God, Clara, I wanted the blood." "I know," she soothed, stroking his hair. "I know. But you stayed." They stayed like that for a long time, the shadows lengthening across the floor. The violence of the afternoon faded, replaced by a desperate, aching need for connection. They moved to the bed, not letting go of each other. The intimacy that followed was not about pleasure. It was about affirmation. It was a frantic, tender reclaiming of life in the face of death. They clung to each other, skin against skin, whispering reassurances in the dark. "I am here. You are here. We are alive." When the room went quiet again, the plan formed in the darkness. "We cannot stay," Eli said into the silence. "The sheriff is gone. The town is against us. If we stay, the next time they won't stop at a warning." "We go to Cheyenne," Clara said. "We take the evidence to Judge Atherton." "It is a 4-day ride," Eli said. "Through open country. Pike controls the roads." "We will go cross-country," Clara said. "Through the foothills. It is rougher, but they won't expect it." "We leave tomorrow night," Eli decided, "under the new moon." But Pike was not waiting for tomorrow. Eli fell into a restless sleep, but Clara lay awake, the pain in her arm a sharp reminder of the stakes. She watched the window. She saw the light before she smelled the smoke. It was a flickering orange glow, reflecting off the low clouds in the south. "Eli!" Clara screamed, shaking him awake. They ran to the window. The stackyard, where Eli had stored the winter hay, the only food for the cattle to survive the coming snows, was an inferno. The fire was massive, fueled by the dry grass and the oil that must have been poured over it. The flames leaped 30 feet into the air, casting a hellish light over the ranch. Eli stood at the window, his hand pressed against the glass. "The hay," he whispered. "It's gone. Without the hay, the herd would starve before January. The bank would foreclose on the loan. The ranch was effectively dead." The fire roared in the distance, a funeral pyre for their hopes. Pike hadn't just sent a warning this time. He had started the countdown. Eli turned from the window. His face was no longer terrified. It was cold and clear, stripped of all doubt. "Get the letters," Eli said. "Pack the saddlebags. We ride now." Winter did not wait for the calendar. It fell upon the high plains in late October, a sudden, brutal crushing of the autumn sky. The clouds lowered themselves until they scraped the tops of the mesas, heavy and metallic, the color of a bruised gun barrel. The wind lost its bluster and gained a razor edge, finding every gap in a coat collar, every crack in a window frame. On the Kincaid Ranch, survival stripped itself of all romance. It was a daily math of calories and warmth. The cattle, already thinned by the drought, huddled in the lee of the ravines, their coats shaggy and frosted with rime. Eli Kincaid stood by the corral fence, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He held his heavy Colt revolver in his hand, the metal dull and cold, beside him. Clara shivered, though she was wrapped in 2 wool shawls. "It is not about strength," Eli said, his voice low and steady against the wind. "It is about the line between your eye and the sight. You must stop shaking." Clara gripped the heavy pistol with both hands. Her knuckles were red and chapped. She was tired. Her bones ached from the cold that seemed to live inside the marrow now. But she did not lower the gun. "I am trying," she said through gritted teeth. "Breathe out," Eli instructed. "Squeeze. Do not pull. A pull jerks the barrel." Clara exhaled, watching the empty tin can perched on the fence post 20 yards away. She thought of the man in the mask who had put a rope around her neck. She thought of the way the world looked at her, as if she were something to be discarded. She tightened her finger. The gun roared, kicking back into her palms with a violence that shocked her every time. The can did not move. Dust kicked up 3 feet to the left. "Again," Eli said. He did not sound disappointed. He sounded like a man teaching someone how to stitch a wound, grim, Necessary work. I hate this, Clara whispered, thumbing back the hammer. I know, Eli said. He stepped behind her, adjusting her elbows, his chest pressing briefly against her back. For a moment, his warmth was the only real thing in the world. I hate that you need it, but the world has teeth. Clara, you must have them too. She fired again. The can spun off the post, clattering into the frozen mud. Eli nodded. Good, reload. Do it until your hands stop shaking. They rode for the county seat 3 days later. The journey to Cheyenne was usually a hard 2-day ride, but with the weather turning and the horses weakened by poor feed, it took them 3. The landscape was a study in desolation. The sagebrush was brittle, snapping under the horses' hooves. They camped in hollows, sleeping back to back under a canvas tarp, taking turns to watch the dark horizon. They were not just fighting the cold, they were hunted. Every shadow on a ridge looked like a rider. Every distant coyote howl sounded like a signal. When they finally rode into Cheyenne, the town felt like an assault on the senses. It was bigger than Red Rock, louder and dirtier. Coal smoke hung low over the streets, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and manure. They stabled the horses and walked toward the courthouse. Clara brushed the travel dust from her skirt, but she knew it was futile. She looked worn. Her dress was mended, her boots scuffed. Beside her, Eli looked like a scarecrow made of wire and leather. His eyes sunk deep in his head. They entered the office of the district attorney. It was a warm room, paneled in dark wood that smelled of beeswax. A clerk sat behind a high desk, scribbling in a ledger. He did not look up when the bell above the door chimed. Excuse me, Eli said, removing his hat. The clerk continued to write. We are here to see Mr. Thorne, Eli said, louder. The clerk paused, dipping his pen. He looked up, his eyes sliding over Eli and landing on Clara. He took in her frayed shawl. The wind burned flush on her cheeks, the way she stood slightly behind the man. He curled his lip. Mr. Thorne is busy with respectable clients, the clerk said, returning to his paper. Deliveries go to the back alley. Clara felt the heat rise in her neck, the familiar burn of shame. She started to turn away, the instinct to hide kicking in. Eli's hand slammed onto the desk. The inkwell jumped. My wife is not a delivery, Eli said. His voice was not a shout. It was a landslide. She is Mrs. Eli Kincaid, and you will look her in the eye when you speak to her. The clerk recoiled, his face paling. The door to the inner office opened, and a man stepped out. Marcus Thorne was not what Clara expected. He was a man who looked like he had not slept in a week. His vest was unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled up, and his gray hair stood up in tufts as if he had been pulling at it. He held a pair of spectacles in one hand. What is the noise? Thorne asked, his voice weary. We have evidence of fraud and theft against Harlan Pike, Eli said, turning to him. And we have proof of judicial corruption in Red Rock. Thorne stopped wiping his glasses. He looked at Eli, really looked at him, measuring the desperation and the resolve. Then he looked at Clara. Pike, Thorne muttered. I have been trying to nail that coffin for 2 years. Come in. In the office? Thorne listened as Clara laid out the story. She spoke of the letters, the fence cutting, the intimidation. She showed him the pages from Sarah's stolen ledger. Thorne rubbed his temples. It is a pattern. I know it is. Pike moves cattle across the border, rebrands them, and sells them as legitimate stock. He uses the profits to buy water rights and squeeze out the small holders. But this, he tapped the ledger page. This is hearsay. It is a page without a book. And your testimony. He hesitated, looking at Clara with a sad kindness. Mrs. Kincaid, a jury will look at your history. Pike's lawyers will tear you apart. They will paint you as a woman of low morals with a grudge. Unless we have a corroborating witness. Someone else who saw the operation? Clara went cold. There was one, Sarah, but she is dead. Anyone else? Thorne asked. Anyone who worked at the Looking Glass? Clara thought back to the smoke and the noise of the saloon. Most of the girls drifted like tumbleweeds. But there was one, Molly, the girl who did the laundry in the back, Molly, who had been there the night Sarah was shot. "There is Molly," Clara said slowly. "I saw her here, in town, just as we rode in. She was carrying a basket behind the hotel." "Find her," Thorne said. "Get her to swear to an affidavit. If I have 2 witnesses, I can get a subpoena for Pike's private records." They found Molly an hour later, behind a boarding house on the east side of town. She was pinning wet sheets to a line, her hands red and swollen from the lye soap. When she saw Clara, she dropped the clothespin basket in the mud. "No," Molly whispered, backing up until she hit the brick wall. "No, Clara, I ain't part of it." "Molly, please," Clara said, stepping over a puddle. "I just need you to tell the truth about what happened to Sarah, about the men Pike sent." "He will kill me," Molly said, her eyes wide and terrified. "He has eyes everywhere, Clara, even here, especially here." "He is killing us anyway," Clara said. "He is taking the land. He is burning people out. If we do not stop him, there will be nowhere left to run." Molly looked at Eli, who stood at the alley entrance, watching the street. She looked back at Clara. "You got out. You got a husband?" "And I am fighting to keep him," Clara said. "Please." Molly let out a shuddering breath. "I finish my shift at 6. I will come to the lawyer's office, but then I'm getting on a train west. I won't stay." "Thank you," Clara said. They walked back toward the main street, a fragile hope growing in Clara's chest. It was shattered before they reached the corner. A man wearing a sheriff's badge stepped out of the barber shop, flanked by 2 deputies. It was not the Red Rock sheriff. This was a local man, but the piece of paper in his hand was fresh. "Clara Vale?" the deputy asked. "Mrs. Kincaid," Eli corrected, stepping in front of her. "I have a warrant here for a Clara Vale," the deputy said, ignoring Eli. "Issued out of Red Rock this morning. Wired over the telegraph. Charge is grand larceny. Theft of a diamond brooch from a Mr. Silas Vance." "That is a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I have never stolen anything." "You can tell it to the judge," the deputy said, reaching for her arm. Eli's hand dropped to his gun. The air in the street froze. The 2 deputies behind the leader put their hands on their own weapons. Passers-by scrambled out of the way. "Eli, no," Clara said. "They are framing you," Eli said, his eyes fixed on the deputy. "If they take you, you will never make it to the hearing." "If you draw that gun," the deputy said, "we will shoot you down right here, and then she hangs for sure." Eli stood on the precipice. His entire body screamed to fight. He could draw. He was fast enough. He could kill this man. But then what? They would be outlaws. They would be hunted for the rest of their lives. He would become the violence he feared. "Eli," Clara said sharply. She stepped out from behind him. She put her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Do not do it. I will not run. I will not give them the satisfaction." She looked at the deputy. "I am innocent. I will face the magistrate." The deputy smirked and slapped handcuffs on her wrists. "Right this way, honey." The jail cell was cold and smelled of vomit. Eli sat on the bench outside the bars, refusing to leave. He had sent a runner for Thorne. When the lawyer arrived, he looked grim. "They are moving fast. They want a preliminary hearing now. They want to discredit her before she can testify against Pike." "Can you stop it?" Eli asked. "I can represent her." Thorne said, "But the Judge Atherton is a hard man. He hates vice." The courtroom was packed. Word had spread that a fallen woman was on trial. Men packed the gallery, chewing tobacco and whispering when Clara was led in, the shackles clinking. A ripple of laughter went through the room. She wore her travel-stained gray dress. She held her head up, but her face was burning. She felt naked. Every stare felt like a hand grabbing at her. The prosecutor was a slick man from Denver, paid for by the syndicate. He did not ask about the brooch. He asked about her past. "Is it true, Miss Vale?" He paced in front of the witness stand. "That you worked at the Looking Glass Saloon?" "Yes," Clara said. Her voice was a whisper. "Speak up," the judge barked. Yes, Clara said louder. And what were your duties there? The prosecutor sneered. Did they involve hospitality? I served drinks, Clara said. And for a price? Did you offer other comforts? Objection! Thorne stood up. Relevance. It goes to character. Your Honor. The prosecutor smiled. A woman who sells herself will certainly sell a lie. The gallery laughed. The sound crashed over Clara like a wave. She gripped the rail of the stand. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to sink into the floor. She looked at Eli. He was sitting in the front row. He was not looking at the floor. He was looking at her. His eyes were fierce, filled with a love that saw past the dirt and the shame. He nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. Stand. Clara took a breath. She stopped shaking. I survived, Clara said clearly. The room went quiet. I did what I had to do to eat. I lived in a place where men like you, she looked at the prosecutor, came to do things they would not do in front of their wives. I saw their secrets. I saw their cruelty. She turned to the judge. I did not steal a brooch, but I saw Harlan Pike steal a life. I saw his men shoot a girl named Sarah because she found a ledger. I am not here to hide who I was. I am here to tell you who he is. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Eli was called. He took the stand. He was awkward, his large frame too big for the chair. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. My wife is the bravest person I know, Eli said to the jury. She has worked my land until her hands bled. She has faced starvation and threats. She did not steal. This warrant is a lie to protect a thief who is stealing the water from every ranch in this county. Judge Atherton peered over his spectacles. He looked at the prosecutor, then at Clara. The warrant for the brooch is suspicious. The judge rumbled. The evidence is thin. However, the accusation against Mr. Pike is grave. You claim there is a ledger? Yes, Clara said. Sarah found it. It lists the bribes. It lists the rebranded cattle. Where is this ledger? The judge asked. Pike has it, Clara said. Or he destroyed it. I cannot issue a ruling on a missing book. The judge said, I will recess this hearing until tomorrow morning. If you can produce this ledger or a witness who has seen it, I will dismiss the charges against you and open an inquiry into Pike. If not, you will stand trial for larceny. It was a reprieve, but a terrifying one. They were released on bail, paid by Thorne. They stood outside the courthouse in the gathering dark. Molly never came, Thorne said, checking his pocket watch. She must have run, so we have no witness, Eli said. And no ledger. Pike is in town, Thorne said. He stays at the Cattlemen's Club. He has a private suite on the second floor. If the ledger exists, it is in his safe. We cannot just walk in and ask for it, Eli said. Clara looked at the building down the street. The Cattlemen's Club. It was a place of mahogany and cigar smoke. A place where rich men felt safe. No, Clara said. We cannot ask. She looked at her hands. But I know how to get into rooms where men think they are safe. The plan was madness. It was dangerous and ethically gray. But it was the only card they had left. They waited until midnight. The streets were empty, save for the occasional drunk stumbling home. They went to the alley behind the club. The service entrance was locked. But Clara knew the type of lock. She used a hairpin and the small knife she carried. It took 10 seconds. Stay here, she whispered to Eli. I am coming with you, he hissed. You are too big, she said. You walk like a rancher. I walk like a ghost. Watch the door. If anyone comes, whistle. She slipped inside. The kitchen was dark, smelling of stale grease. She moved through the shadows, her feet silent on the floorboards. She knew the layout of these places. The best rooms were always upstairs, facing the street. She climbed the back stairs. The hallway was dimly lit by a gas sconce. She counted the doors. Suite A. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Pike would be asleep. Or out gambling. She tried the handle. Locked. She picked it. She slipped inside. The room was opulent. A heavy 4-poster bed, a desk, a large iron safe in the corner. Pike was not in the bed. Clara moved to the safe. It was locked, of course. She bit her lip. She could not pick a safe. She scanned the room. Men like Pike were arrogant. They did not think anyone would dare touch their things. She checked the desk drawers. Nothing. She checked the hollow of the false book on the shelf. Nothing. Then she saw it. A jacket hanging on the chair. Pike's dinner jacket. She patted the pockets. Her fingers brushed cold metal. A key on a chain. She grabbed it. She went to the safe. The key fit. The heavy door swung open. Inside, stacked among bundles of cash, was a black leather book. She grabbed it. She opened it to a random page. Judge Halloway, $500. Sheriff Miller, $200. Got you? She whispered. The door to the hallway opened. Clara froze. Harlan Pike stood in the doorway. He was a large man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been stamped from a coin. He was holding a candle. He saw the open safe. He saw Clara. "Well," Pike said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I was wondering when you would try." Clara did not hesitate. She threw the heavy ledger at the candle in his hand. The candle flew. Darkness engulfed the room. Clara dove for the door. Pike lunged, grabbing her skirt. She kicked backward, her heel connecting with his shin. He grunted and let go. She scrambled into the hallway. "Thief!" Pike roared. "Guards!" Clara sprinted for the back stairs. Heavy boots were thundering up from the lobby. She burst out the back door into the alley. "Run!" she screamed at Eli. They scrambled onto their horses. A gunshot cracked the air, the bullet chipping the brick inches from Eli's head. "Go! Go!" Eli shouted, slapping her horse's rump. They tore out of the alley, hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones. They galloped down the main street, past the startled late-night drinkers. Behind them, the bell of the Cattlemen's Club was ringing, a frantic, clanging alarm. They hit the open prairie as the moon broke through the clouds. The wind hit them like a hammer. They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limit. The cold air burned their lungs, tasting of iron and fear. "They will follow," Eli shouted over the wind. "The sheriff will deputize a posse." "We have the book," Clara yelled back, patting the saddlebag where she had shoved the ledger. "We cannot go back to town," Eli said. "They will arrest us before we see the judge. We need to get to the ranch. We can hold them off there. We have rifles and ammunition." It was a desperate logic. The ranch was a trap, but it was their trap. They rode through the night, the horses stumbling on the frozen ground. By the time the sun rose, painting the world in a blood-red light, they were crossing the boundary line of the Kincaid claim. They were exhausted. Their faces were gray with cold. They pulled up in the yard, the horses blowing hard, steam rising from their flanks in clouds. "We made it!" Clara gasped. Sliding from the saddle, her legs gave way, and she fell into the dust. Eli jumped down and hauled her up. "Inside. Now, we have to barricade the windows." He looked back at the horizon. A cloud of dust was rising in the east. Pike's riders, and in the north, another cloud. The sheriff's posse. They were coming from both sides, the hammer and the anvil. Eli dragged Clara into the house and slammed the heavy oak door. He dropped the bar into place with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. "Load the rifles," Eli said. Outside, the wind began to howl, and the sound of 50 horses thundered against the earth. The sky above the Kincaid ranch was a hard, blinding white, stripped of color by the biting cold of the early winter morning. It hung over the valley like a lid, trapping the sound of the wind and the rhythmic, desperate pounding of a hammer. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and stale coffee. Eli Kincaid was fortifying the only home he had ever known. He drove long iron nails into thick oak planks, sealing the windows. Every blow of the hammer was a declaration of refusal. He moved the heavy dresser in front of the back door. He overturned the kitchen table, creating a barricade facing the front entrance. Clara moved through the house with a silence that contrasted sharply with Eli's frantic industry. She was not panicking. Panic was a luxury for people who expected to be saved. Clara Vale had learned long ago that no one was coming, so she prepared herself. She laid out the ammunition on a clean towel spread across the floor behind the overturned table. Boxes of 44 caliber cartridges for the rifle, heavy lead slugs for the shotgun. She counted them aloud, her voice steady. 40 rifle rounds, she said. 12 for the shotgun. 6 in your pistol. 6 in mine. Eli stopped hammering. He looked at her. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature in the room. He looked at her hands. They were not shaking. You are too calm, Eli said. His voice was rough. I have been in rooms where men wanted to hurt me before, Clara said, snapping the loading gate of the Winchester shut. Fear makes your hands sweat. Wet hands slip on the trigger. I will be afraid later. Eli, when we are alive. She took the black ledger, the book that contained the secrets of Harlan Pike's empire, and wrapped it in oilcloth. She pried up a loose floorboard near the hearth, a hiding place she had discovered while scrubbing the floors weeks ago. She wedged the book deep into the crawl space and hammered the board back down. If they burn the house, Eli said, watching her, the book goes too. If they burn the house. Clara stood up, brushing dust from her knees. We will be dead, and the book will not matter. Outside, the wind carried the sound of voices. Not the chaotic shouting of a mob, but the low, organized murmur of men who knew they held all the cards. Eli moved to a slit he had left between the window boards. He peered out. They are here, he said. Harlan Pike sat on a massive black gelding 50 yards from the porch. He was dressed in a heavy buffalo hide coat, his silver hair perfectly combed beneath his hat. Flanking him were Silas Vance and the corrupt Sheriff Miller. Behind them, a posse of 20 men, some hired guns, some townsfolk who had been bullied or bought into believing they were serving justice. Pike raised a gloved hand. The line of riders stopped. Kincaid, Pike's voice carried easily over the distance. It was a rich, baritone voice, the voice of a man who was used to being listened to in boardrooms and churches. There is no need for this ugliness. Eli did not answer. He checked the sight on his rifle. I have a warrant for the woman. Pike called out, Surrender her. Give me the item she stole from my safe. Do that, and you keep your land. You have my word. Your word is worth nothing, Eli shouted back. And the warrant is a lie. Think about it, son, Pike said, his tone shifting to a mock paternal disappointment. You are a rancher. You belong here. Do not throw your life away for a saloon girl who is dragging you down to hell. Send her out. We will treat her fairly. She will get a trial. Inside the dark house, Clara leaned her back against the rough logs of the wall. She closed her eyes. The words seeped into her like cold water. Saloon girl. Dragging you down. She looked at Eli. He was crouched by the window, his profile sharp and hard in the sliver of light. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 days. Eli? Clara whispered. He turned to her. He is right, she said. Her voice broke, just once, before she clamped it down. If I go out there, if I give them the book, you survive, you keep the ranch, you can rebuild. No, Eli said. I am poison to you, Clara said, stepping toward him. Look at this. Look at what I brought to your door. Violence, sieges, ruin. I ruin everything I touch. Eli, it is what I am. Eli stood up. He walked to her, ignoring the danger outside. He took her face in his broad, calloused hands. He forced her to look at him. Listen to me, he said fiercely. Before you came here, I was not living. I was hiding. I was a ghost on my own land, terrified of my own shadow, terrified of my father's blood. I was waiting to die. He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You did not ruin my life, Clara, he said. You woke it. You made me a man who stands up. If you go out that door, you take my life with you. I would rather die with you in this house than live 100 years without you. Clara stared at him. The shame that had defined her for so long. The belief that she was dirty, disposable, a burden, cracked under the weight of his absolute certainty. He saw her. He chose her. Okay, she breathed. She gripped his wrists. Okay, we stay. We stay, Eli said. He turned back to the window. "Pike, go to hell!" Pike sighed, a theatrical gesture visible even from the house. He turned to Sheriff Miller. "Do your duty. Sheriff, serve the warrant." "Open fire," Miller shouted. The world exploded. The sound was not like thunder. It was sharper, a cracking, tearing noise that filled the cabin. Bullets slammed into the heavy timber walls, thudding like hail. The window boards splintered, sending showers of sharp wood flying across the room. Eli fired. He worked the lever of the Winchester with a mechanical rhythm. Crack-clack, crack-clack. "Keep your head down," he roared. Clara was on her knees behind the overturned table. She was not shooting wildly. She had the shotgun rested on the table leg. She watched the door. A shadow fell across the crack beneath the door. Someone was on the porch. Clara pulled the trigger. The heavy recoil bruised her shoulder, but the buckshot blew a hole through the door panel at knee height. A scream of pain erupted from the other side, followed by the sound of a body tumbling down the steps. "They are flanking!" Eli shouted, moving to the side window. "Watch the back!" Clara scrambled to the bedroom door. She pressed herself against the frame. Pistol raised, the back window was boarded, but she saw the wood bowing inward. Someone was using a sledgehammer. "Eli, the bedroom!" she screamed. Eli spun, firing blindly through the wall where the hammering was coming from. The hammering stopped, but the front was overwhelmed. Bullets shattered the oil lamp on the shelf, spraying glass. A slug tore through the sleeve of Eli's shirt, leaving a line of red. He hissed, but did not stop firing. "There are too many!" Eli yelled. He was reloading, his fingers fumbling for a second. In that second, Silas Vance appeared at the gap in the front window, leveling a pistol at Eli's exposed back. Clara saw him. She did not think. She did not calculate. She moved. She lunged across the room, grabbing Eli's belt and yanking him backward with all her strength. "Down!" she shrieked. Eli fell back just as Vance fired. The bullet buried itself in the log wall exactly where Eli's heart had been a second before. From the floor, Clara raised her pistol. She braced her wrist on her knee. She aimed at the gap where Vance's face was. She fired. Vance grunted and disappeared from the window, clutching his shoulder. "You hit him," Eli gasped, staring at her. "I aimed for the shoulder," Clara said, her voice trembling now. "Survival, Eli, not murder." The firing outside suddenly intensified, but it was different. It wasn't directed at the house. It was directed away from it. Shouts of confusion erupted from the yard. "Hold fire!" Pike's voice screamed, cracking with panic. "Hold fire!" Eli and Clara froze. They looked at each other. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. "What is happening?" Clara whispered. Eli crawled to the window. He peered out through the shattered boards. "My God," he breathed. A new group of riders had entered the yard. They wore long dusters and rode tall, fresh horses. At the lead was Marcus Thorne, the lawyer from Cheyenne, and beside him, wearing a badge that caught the white sunlight, was a federal marshal. But it wasn't just them. Behind the lawmen rode a dozen men from Red Rock, the blacksmith, the owner of the livery stable, men who had stood silent for months. They held shotguns and hunting rifles, and their barrels were pointed at Pike's mercenaries. "Drop your weapons," the marshal bellowed. His voice was like iron. "By order of the United States District Court." Sheriff Miller looked at Pike, then at the marshal. He dropped his gun in the dirt. One by one, the hired guns lowered their rifles. They were paid to fight farmers, not feds. Pike sat on his horse, his face a mask of purple rage. He was alone in the center of the yard, stripped of his army. Eli kicked the barricade away from the door. He threw the bolt and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle in hand. Clara followed him, stepping into the biting cold. "It is over. Pike," Eli said. Thorne rode forward, waving a sheaf of papers. "Judge Atherton signed the order this morning. Pike, your assets are frozen pending a federal investigation into racketeering, land fraud, and murder. The witness you thought you scared off? Molly? She didn't run. She came to my office last night." Pike looked at Thorne, then at Eli. His eyes were the eyes of a trapped wolf, wild, yellow, and devoid of reason. "You think a piece of paper stops me?" Pike snarled. "I built this valley. I own this earth." He reached into his saddlebag. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a glass bottle with a rag stuffed in the neck. Kerosene. He struck a match on his saddle horn. "If I cannot have it," Pike screamed, "no one will." He hurled the bottle. It did not hit the house. It sailed over Eli's head and smashed against the dry, weathered wood of the barn. The explosion of flame was instant. The dry timber, seasoned by decades of wind and sun, caught like paper. A wall of fire roared up the side of the structure. "The horses!" Clara screamed. "The barn doors were closed. The animals were trapped inside." Eli did not hesitate. He handed his rifle to Clara and ran toward the burning building. "Eli, no!" Clara cried, but he was already moving. Pike laughed, a high, thin sound. He spurred his horse, trying to break through the line of townsfolk to escape. "Stop him!" the marshal shouted. But Eli was focused on the barn. He reached the doors, the heat blistering his skin. He threw the latch and heaved the doors open. Smoke billowed out, black and choking. The horses, terrified and screaming, bolted out of the inferno, nearly trampling him. Eli dove to the side, rolling in the dirt. The fire had climbed to the loft. The roof groaned. Eli scrambled up. He looked back at the yard. Pike had not escaped. His horse had reared at the sudden roar of the fire, throwing him. He was scrambling in the dust, trying to reach his dropped pistol. Eli walked toward him. He did not run. He walked with a terrifying, slow purpose. The heat of the burning barn was at his back, casting a long, dancing shadow before him. Pike grabbed the gun. He rolled onto his back, aiming at Eli. "Stop!" the marshal shouted, raising his rifle. But Eli was closer. He reached Pike before the man could fire. He kicked the gun out of Pike's hand. The pistol spun away into the weeds. Eli reached down and grabbed Pike by the lapels of his expensive coat. He hauled the older man to his feet as if he were made of straw. Eli pulled back his fist. Every instinct in his blood, every memory of his father's rage, screamed at him to strike, to smash this man's face until it was nothing but ruin, to kill the threat. Pike flinched, closing his eyes, waiting for the blow. Eli held the fist in the air. His arm trembled. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. The fire roared behind him, consuming the labor of his life, the barn his father built. Eli looked at Pike's pathetic, fear-twisted face. He looked at the marshal. He looked at Clara, who stood on the porch, her hands pressed to her mouth. Eli lowered his hand. He shoved Pike backward, hard. Pike stumbled and fell into the dirt at the marshal's feet. "I am not you," Eli said. His voice was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the yard, everyone heard it. "I do not kill for pride. Take him." The marshal stepped forward and hauled Pike up, slapping cuffs on his wrists. Sheriff Miller was already being tied up by the blacksmith. It was over, but the cost was high. The barn was a skeleton of flame. The roof collapsed with a crash that shook the ground, sending a geyser of sparks into the white sky. The winter feed was gone. The tack was gone. Eli stood watching it burn. His shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had held him upright drained away, leaving him swaying on his feet. Clara ran to him. She did not care about the marshal, or the townsfolk, or the smoke. She ran to him and slammed into his chest, wrapping her arms around him so tightly it hurt. "You are alive!" She sobbed into his coat. "You are alive!" Eli held her. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of gunpowder and rosewater. He shook. The tears came then, hot and fast, a release of the terror he had carried for weeks. "We lost the barn," he whispered. "We lost the tools." "We kept the house," Clara said, pulling back to look at him. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. "We kept the land, and we kept us." She took his face in her hands, just as he had done for her inside. "I choose you, Eli Kincaid," she said. "With a barn or without it, rich or poor, I am still here. I am still here." Eli repeated. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation and relief. It was a seal on a contract written in blood and smoke. Behind them, the marshal was leading Pike away. The townsfolk were beginning to form a bucket brigade from the creek, trying to keep the fire from spreading to the house. The community was returning, tentatively, to aid the man who had stood his ground. The sun began to dip low in the west, turning the smoke-filled sky a bruised purple. Later, inside the house, the silence returned. The windows were still boarded, but the door was open to let out the smoke. They sat on the floor, leaning against the overturned table. They were too tired to move the furniture back. Eli had wrapped Clara's hands in clean bandages where the recoil of the shotgun had split her skin. Pike is not the only one, Eli said quietly into the gloom. The syndicate is big. They will send someone else. Maybe next year, maybe in 5 years. Let them come, Clara said. She rested her head on his shoulder. We know how to fight now. Eli put his arm around her. The fear of his own blood, the fear of his father's legacy, was gone. He had held fire in his hand and he had chosen not to burn. Yes, Eli said. We know how to fight. The room grew dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the barn fire outside, casting a warm, flickering glow on their faces. They sat together in the wreckage of their battle, holding on to the peace they had earned, fade to black. The smoke from the barn hung in the valley for 3 days, a gray shroud that refused to lift. It settled into the snow that had finally come, turning the pristine white drifts into a dirty, streaked slate. The winter of 1885 was not a season of rest. It was a season of penance. The Kincaid Ranch had survived the siege, but it was a broken thing. The blackened skeleton of the barn stood like a rotten tooth against the sky. The supplies were dangerously low. The hay was gone, burned by Pike's malice, and the cattle were growing thin, their ribs showing through their winter coats like the rungs of a ladder. Eli and Clara did not stop. Survival was a rhythm they knew by heart now. They worked from the moment the sun greased the eastern horizon until long after the moon claimed the sky. They dismantled the ruins of the barn, salvaging what nails and timber had not been consumed. They rebuilt the corrals. They rode miles every day to chop cottonwood branches to feed the cattle, the bark providing just enough sustenance to keep the animals alive until the thaw. Their hands were perpetually raw, cracked by the cold and the work. Their faces were wind-burned. They spoke little during the day, conserving their energy for the labor. But the silence was no longer heavy. It was the companionable silence of 2 people pulling on the same rope. The town of Red Rock did not change overnight. Prejudice, Clara learned, was like the mesquite root. You could chop it down, but the tangled knot of it lived deep underground. When they rode into town a month after the fire to speak with the new interim sheriff, the reaction was fractured. They walked into the mercantile, and the silence that greeted them was familiar, yet different. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife who had once called Clara trash, was standing by the counter. She looked at Clara, then at Eli, then at the bandage still wrapped around Clara's hand. She turned pink. She did not smile, but she nodded, a stiff, jerky motion of her chin. "Good morning, Mrs." Gable said. Her voice was tight, as if the words tasted like vinegar. "Good morning," Clara replied evenly, but at the other end of the counter, a man named Henderson, who had sold grain to Pike for years, spat on the floor as they passed. He turned his back, muttering about thieves and luck. Clara did not flinch. She did not look at Eli to see if he was angry. She simply bought her flour and walked out. Outside. Eli stopped her. "He should not have done that. He can do what he likes," Clara said, adjusting her shawl against the biting wind. "I cannot earn them all. Eli, I am done trying to be the woman they want me to be. I can only be the woman who lives the truth." "The truth is enough," Eli said. He took her arm, not to lead her, but to walk with her. The healing of the past required more than just work. It required a burial. In late February, on a day when the wind had died down enough to make the outdoors bearable. Clara rode to the high ridge overlooking the southern pass. It was not a graveyard, but it was a place of long views and deep silence. She dismounted and tied her horse to a scrub oak. She walked to the edge of the drop-off. She held a small bundle in her hand, the dried flower from her wedding bouquet, which she had saved in her trunk, and the ribbon she had worn the night she left the border town. She was not near Sarah's grave. Sarah was buried in a pauper's plot 300 miles south, but the spirit of the grief was here, in the freedom of the wind. "I did it," Clara said aloud. Her voice was small in the vastness of the basin. "I told them, Sarah, I told the judge, I told the town. They know what he did to you." She waited, half expecting the wind to answer. There was only silence, but it was a clean silence. "I am not running anymore," Clara continued. "I have a home. I have a man who sees me. I am not just a survivor. I am living." She placed the flower and the ribbon under a heavy stone, anchoring them against the elements. She stood there for a long time, letting the cold air scour out the last of the shame she had carried for 5 years. When she turned back to the horse, she felt lighter, as if she had set down a heavy pack she hadn't realized she was carrying. Eli, too, had ghosts to lay to rest. It happened in the livery stable. He was negotiating for a load of hay to replace what had been burned. The stable owner was an old man named Jeb, who had lived in the valley since the first stakes were driven. "You drive a hard bargain, Kincaid?" Jeb grunted, chewing on a piece of straw. "Just like your daddy." Eli froze. The comparison usually made his stomach turn. "He was a hard man," Jeb said, looking Eli up and down. "Mean as a rattlesnake when the drink was in him. I saw him break a man's jaw once for looking at him wrong. You got his size. You got his shoulders." Eli stood tall. He did not look at his boots. He looked Jeb in the eye. "I have his shoulders," Eli said calmly. "But I do not have his hands. My hands build fences. They do not break men for pride." Jeb paused. He looked at Eli, really looked at him, seeing the quiet strength that had replaced the cowering boy of 10 years ago. "No," Jeb admitted. "No, I suppose you do not. You did good with Pike, son. You let the law handle him. Your daddy would have shot him dead and burned the town down to do it." "I am not my father," Eli said. It was a simple statement, but it rang with the force of a church bell. "I am Eli Kincaid." He walked out of the stable with the hay order signed, leaving the shadow of his father in the dust where it belonged. Spring arrived, not with a gentle blooming, but with a violent thaw. The snow melted in days, turning the dry creek beds into roaring torrents. The mud was ankle-deep, sucking at boots and wagon wheels, but under the mud, the green was pushing through. The legal victory came with the mud. A courier from Cheyenne delivered the final judgment. Harlan Pike had been convicted of fraud, racketeering, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His assets were seized. The water rights to the upper creek were fully restored to the Kincaid claim. The corrupt sheriff, Miller, had fled the territory, likely heading for Mexico. "It is over," Eli said, reading the letter at the kitchen table. The morning sun was streaming through the new glass panes he had installed in the windows. "The water is ours. The land is secure." Clara sat across from him, mending a shirt. "It is strange," she said, "to wake up and not be afraid." "We earned it," Eli said, but their victory had created space for more than just relief. It had created space for generosity. 2 weeks later, they found him in the hayloft of the new barn they were raising. He was a boy, no more than 14. He was curled up in a corner, shivering under a horse blanket. His skin was dark, his hair black and straight, likely mixed heritage. Part Crow or Sioux, part white. In this part of the country, that mix often meant he belonged nowhere. Eli found him when he went to toss down feed. The boy scrambled back, eyes wide with terror, expecting a beating. "Easy," Eli said, raising his hands. "I am not going to hurt you." The boy scrambled for the ladder. "I was just sleeping. I did not steal nothing." "I believe you," Eli said. "It is cold outside. You hungry?" The boy stopped. Hunger warred with fear in his face. Eli brought him to the house. Clara did not ask questions. She saw the fear in the boy's eyes, the same fear she had seen in the mirror for years. She set a plate of eggs and biscuits on the table. "Sit," Clara said. "Eat." The boy ate like a starving wolf. When he was done, he looked at them, waiting for the price. "What is your name?" Eli asked. "Leo," the boy mumbled. "Folks in town ran me off. Said they did not want no half-breeds hanging round." "We need a hand," Eli said, pouring himself coffee. "We are rebuilding the barn. It is hard work. Pay is $5 a month and a room in the bunkhouse once it is built. Until then, you can sleep in the loft, but we will give you blankets that aren't full of mites." Leo stared at him. "You hiring me?" "If you work," Eli said. "I do not care about your blood. Leo, I care about your back and your word." Leo looked at Clara. She smiled, and it was a genuine, warm thing. "We have plenty of food," she said. "And we could use the help." Leo stayed, and in taking him in, the love that Eli and Clara had built between them stopped being a fortress and became a shelter. But trauma did not vanish just because the sun was shining. One evening in April, the wind kicked up, rattling the shutters. Clara was asleep, but the noise dragged her into a nightmare. She was back in the saloon. Pike was there. The rope was around her neck. She woke up screaming, thrashing in the sheets, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Clara! Clara!" Eli was there instantly. He did not shake her. He did not shout. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest, anchoring her body with his own heaviness. "I am here," he rumbled into her ear. His voice was deep, vibrating through her spine. "You are in the ranch house. The door is locked. Pike is in prison. I am here." Clara gasped, clutching his arms. I thought he was back." "He is gone," Eli said. He kept repeating it, a steady chant against the panic. "He is gone. You are safe. The grass is green. The creek is running. I am holding you." Slowly, the terror receded. Clara slumped against him, exhausted. "Does it ever go away?" she whispered in the dark. "I do not know," Eli admitted. "But you do not have to carry it alone when it comes." He stroked her hair until her breathing evened out. He was her anchor, not because he was fearless, but because he knew the shape of her fear and did not judge it. May brought the wildflowers. The valley was a carpet of yellow and purple. The cattle were fattening up on the new grass. One evening, after Leo had gone to the loft, Eli and Clara were in the bedroom. The window was open, letting in the scent of sage and wet earth. Clara was brushing her hair. She looked at Eli in the mirror. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling off his boots. He looked up and caught her gaze. He looked different than the man she had met in the rain 6 months ago. He was broader, not in bone, but in presence. The shy hunch was gone. Clara put down the brush. She turned to face him. A playful light danced in her green eyes, something bright and new. She walked to the bed. She stood between his knees, looking down at him. "Mr. Kincaid," she said softly. Eli looked up, his hands pausing on his boot heel. "Mrs. Kincaid," Clara smiled. She reached out and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, her fingers lingering on the skin. "I am your wife," she said, echoing the words she had spoken in terror on their first night. But this time, the words were not a plea for safety. They were a claim. "Can I—" She trailed off, her eyebrow raised. A challenge and an invitation wrapped in one. Eli laughed. It was a rusty sound, but full of joy. He reached out and pulled her down onto his lap. "You can," he promised, kissing the hollow of her throat. "You can do anything you like." The fade to black was not a hiding of shame, but a closing of the curtain on a moment that belonged only to them. It was a joy that needed no audience. The world, however, always had one last test. It came in June. A fence on the northern boundary was cut. Not by a syndicate, but by two drifters who had heard the rumors of Pike's old war and thought the sissy rancher would be an easy mark for rustling. Eli saw them from the ridge. He rode down, rifle in hand, but he wasn't alone. Leo was riding beside him, looking fierce on a pony Eli had broken for him. And from the east, 3 riders appeared. It was the blacksmith and his sons. They had seen the dust and ridden out to check. The drifters looked at Eli. They looked at the boy. They looked at the neighbors riding down the hill with shotguns across their laps. "We are just passing through," the drifter yelled, turning his horse rapidly. "Keep passing," Eli called out. He didn't even raise his rifle. The drifters fled. Eli looked at the blacksmith, who tipped his hat. "Thought you might need an extra set of eyes." "Eli," the blacksmith called. "Obliged," Eli said. He turned his horse back toward the house. He was not isolated. He was part of a community that was slowly, painfully learning to be better. The story ends on the porch. It was dusk. The sky was a riot of orange and violet, bleeding into the deep indigo of the coming night. The air was cool, smelling of the creek and the cattle. Eli sat in the rocking chair he had mended. Clara sat on the railing, leaning back against the post. Leo was down by the corral, playing a harmonica, the lonely, sweet notes drifting up to them. Eli reached out his hand. Clara took it. Her hand was rough, calloused, scarred from the wire and the work. His hand was large, the knuckles swollen from the cold. They were not perfect hands. They were hands that had known violence and fear. They were hands that had dug graves and built fences. "It is a hard country," Clara said, looking out at the darkening hills. "It is," Eli agreed. He squeezed her fingers. "But it is ours." Clara looked at him. She saw the lines around his eyes, the gray starting to show in his temples. She saw the man who had saved her, and the man she had saved in return. "I am glad I got off that stagecoach," she said softly. "I am glad you did too," Eli said. They sat there as the stars began to punch through the twilight, hand in hand. 2 survivors who had walked through the fire and found that the only thing that didn't burn was love. Thank you for listening to this story of Eli and Clara. It has been a journey through the dust, the danger, and the quiet redemption of the American West. I hope their story of resilience and hard-won love resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and let me know which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West so you do not miss our next adventure. Share your thoughts on the ending in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your fences strong and your hearts open.